Good. Hey. Hey. Nice to meet you.
Are you
I am. Yeah. Unless you want to.
You're mic'd up, so.
Yeah.
I want project done, but I also want to
Well, I'm sure that,
you try to pull some kind of act. But it could just be because that
wait, you probably need to
Really late. It's okay. Yeah.
Don't be shy. Front row. Extra churros. So, fan.
churros? Like Disneyland.
What's that? Right, that's
I'm assuming so.
Oh, I got one. Thanks. Churros is like Disneyland.
I know. And these are gourmet churros, not just skinny churros, but
Sounds delicious.
we'll talk more about churros later. But well, we have a packed house tonight, but we'll have some people filtering in.
Wait, we're not ready.
Well, as soon as we are live, I will welcome you all. I'm amazed at the maximum capacity is on there. Can you imagine? Just standing wall to wall.
You guys lost it.
Maybe they're including the balcony. The dance party. Yeah. So, this is Scott. He's in charge of the churros. So, we'll give him more kudos later when we're live. Some of you might know Scott. He's awesome. Did everyone find it okay?
That's a good thing, right?
Yeah, this is a little more accessible. Well, some of you, I know, some of you are new faces. Excited to meet you. But if you haven't gotten some water, feel free.
It's lovely. It really is. Thank
Oh,
you.
good. I drilled the well myself, and we just put that label on to trick you. So, will you tell Amanda to make a few posts to the people conferencing in live to make sure they know we're still doing this? We're live. Oh, good. So, welcome. I don't have a microphone, but should I go ahead? Can you hear me?
Yeah, just talk about it.
So, welcome everyone. I don't know why we have people sitting on the back row. The front row is empty. But welcome, hello to all of our Facebook people who are conferencing in. We're excited to see you here. I wish I could see you, but I'm Amy Stevens-Seal. I'm the CEO of the LDS Matchmaker, and I'm excited to introduce Dr. Brian Willoughby here tonight. You'll be able to see him in just a second, but I'm just going to tell you about him because he is an incredible person and speaker. He is, of course, speaking on the science of attraction, a subject that we all care a lot about, it turns out. And in my work with clients, that's something that always comes up, of course. It's something that we want to feel connected to the person that we're ultimately going to be with, physically, spiritually, emotionally, in all of those areas, of course. So he's going to delve more into how does it work? How does attraction work? And he has a pretty incredible background. So Brian first got his bachelor's degree at BYU, and then he went on to study into his master's and his doctorate at the University of Minnesota. And he's published in many of the top academic journals, and he is recognized as an industry expert and has studied and been published with incredible work in marital relationships, and I am going to let him take it from there and share more because there's a lot, his biography is so long that I just kind of pulled a few tidbits to share with you tonight. But we have worked quite a bit with him at the LDS Matchmaker and been able to glean a lot from the research that he has done. And so without further ado, I'm going to let him take it away.
Thanks. All right. So thanks, Amy. So I'm not going to bore you with the details of my biography at all, but I will just share a little bit more about kind of my interest in this area. So I started actually studying just healthy marriage at the University of Minnesota, studying with Bill Doherty, who's one of the top marriage and family therapists in the world. And as I was studying my graduate work, I got more and more interested not just in how people are in healthy marriages and why some marriages succeed, why some marriages don't succeed, but how people end up getting into marriage or not, and what does healthy dating look like. And I spent most of my career then studying that premarital phase of life, mostly with young adults in their 20s and early 30s. I do a little bit of adolescent work as well. But as I said, most of my research is on trying to understand why some people end up getting married, why some people don't, how that process looks, what it looks like. So I've done research on sexual activity, cohabitation, dating trajectories, marital beliefs, kind of anything you can think of that might be connected to marriage. That's what I've done. I'm a bit of an eclectic researcher in that way. And tonight we're going to be talking about attraction, which is obviously a big part of a lot of those things that I just talked about. And just to set up where I want to go with this, and one thing I'll say, we're going to have time for questions at the end, but if anyone has a super pressing question in the audience and you want to ask during, it's okay. I'm used to being interrupted by students and things. Classes start tomorrow for me, so this will be good practice of getting interrupted by my students. But the overall agenda, what I want to walk you through is to kind of give you a crash course on what science is telling us about attraction. in terms of dating and romantic relationships. Talk about what is attraction, first off. So what are the different components of attraction? What makes us attracted to each other as human beings? So we'll kind of dive into that a little bit deeper about the different parts of different components of attraction. We'll also talk about different types of attraction, what the differences are and why those differences matter. So oftentimes we think about attraction as just one thing. You either are or are not attracted to people. And that's somewhat true, but there's a lot more behind the science. And so we'll kind of talk through some of those differences. And then the big part of what I hope to do today is to talk about why or what you can do with this information. I'm a big believer that when we give people good, solid research information and then talk about how you can utilize it in your daily life, that can be a lot more helpful to people than what we call pop psychology. If you're not familiar with what pop psychology is, if you know Dr. Phil, that is pop psychology. It's kind of feel good, very kind of basic, right, self-motivation, self-help type of things. I'm much more interested in kind of teaching what the actual research is saying, and then, like I said, talking about how you can put that into practice in your own lives. And so that's what we'll be kind of talking about and working through. So let's start off by just talking about the role of attraction and what it does in relationships. And again, that seems pretty straightforward. I'm going to wander a little bit. That seems pretty straightforward, is, well, attraction is there to attract us to each other, so we end up in committed relationships. But again, like a lot of things we're going to talk about today, it's a little bit more complicated than that. That attraction actually serves a different purpose based on what stage in the relationship you're at. And the role and importance of attraction actually varies based on if we're not in a relationship, if we're just starting to date, if we've been together for a couple months, or if we've been together for a couple years. What that role of attraction looks like is actually changing based on that. In fact, the very first thing that attraction does, and actually one of the most important things attraction does in romantic relationships, is right at the very beginning. In fact, before you even start a relationship, we think that is actually the most important role attraction is ever going to play in your life, is before you even talk to the person that you end up marrying. And what a lot of academics talk about when it comes to attraction is what we call a catalyst for contact. And what we mean by that is that we think that attraction is the reason or the motivation for you to actually go up and talk to someone for the first time. That it's that initial attraction that you feel towards another person that is that catalyst. If you're familiar with biology or any of the kind of life sciences, catalyst kind of gets something in motion, kind of pushes it forward. That's what that initial attraction is doing. And that is, we see in the research, regardless of what the setting is. Whether I'm sitting in a bar room across from someone, I see someone across the bar, or I'm sitting in a sacrament meeting. Those are my two extremes that I could think of, right? But it's the same exact process, is that we see someone, and based on a series of things that we see and infer about them, we'll get into kind of more about what those things are, we feel that attraction to them. And what that attraction does for us is it motivates us to go talk, or in some cases, maybe non-verbally communicate with that person. So I start to kind of stare at you a little bit, start to kind of maybe initiate some non-verbal contact, start to stand in your vicinity to see if you'll talk to me. Right? It's that attraction that creates that initial catalyst. Now, that doesn't mean that that's the only thing that attraction does. That after the relationship has begun, attraction continues to be an important part of how we interact with each other, but it changes. One of the things that attraction starts to do once we're in a committed relationship is now it's not necessarily a catalyst for me to talk to you, but it is about what we call relationship effort or relational effort, which means when you're in a relationship with someone, and you've all experienced this, you have to have a certain level of effort or desire to put resources into the relationship. Right? When you're dating someone, it takes time, takes energy, it takes effort. Well, attraction serves to continually motivate me to put effort into the relationship. If I'm attracted to you, I want to keep hanging out with you. I want to talk to you. I want to get to know you. I want to continue to put relationship, or I want to continue to put effort into that relationship. So attraction is still motivating me, even when we're dating, to continue to put that effort in. And that effort is oftentimes what continues to move that relationship further. Even further into the relationship, so even after we're engaged, even after we're married, attraction is still playing a role. And now, oftentimes it's connected to commitment. And commitment is actually one of the most important fundamental parts of a healthy long-term relationship is commitment. One of the things I tell my students sometimes is that if you're going to have anything in a marriage that's going to make it healthy, we oftentimes go to communication skills or conflict resolution skills, and the research doesn't back that up. People that can communicate really effectively, that don't have commitment to each other, they don't last very long. They fight really well with each other. They're very articulate in why they don't like their partner, but they don't necessarily last for decades and decades. It's the people that have commitment that do it. And that attraction is one of the things that continues to build that commitment for us. And so attraction is kind of there at every stage in the relationship, but the effect or what it's doing is changing throughout. And we'll get more into that a little bit later on. But before I get into that more, I do want to kind of break down what is attraction. So what is the science actually telling us that attraction is comprised of? Like I said, it's kind of one of those mythical terms in the relationship sciences. Okay, well, I'm attracted to you. I know I'm attracted to people. I know what that feels like, but where is that coming from? Why am I attracted to that person and not that person? Why am I attracted to that person at a 7 and that person to a 4? What we think is happening is that all of us have attraction that's comprised of at least 3 different broad components. So the research says that part of what makes you attracted to other people is biological. So there is a biological component of what makes us attracted to each other. I'm going to touch on that just a little bit, kind of share a little bit of the research on that for you, and then we're going to talk about why that's pretty irrelevant to our discussion today. You can probably already start to think about why biological attraction might not be super helpful to you in terms of kind of what you can do to improve your attraction to other people, but it is still a part of it, so you want to talk about it a little bit. So these are these things that are more universal. So they're things that kind of make people universally more attracted to others across cultures, across kind of time. Again, it's more about evolutionary science, about biology, about genetics. That's one part of what makes us attractive to each other. Another part, and this one we're going to spend a lot of time talking about today, is cultural. So another thing that makes us attractive to each other is based on cultural attraction. The aspects of our culture that are socialized or taught to you through the media, through your peers, through your family, where you've gotten all these messages throughout your life about this is what is attractive, this is what should be attractive to you, this is what's going to make you attracted to other people. That's another part of what makes us attracted to each other. And then finally, there's a personal component to this. There's an agentive component to attraction. So each one of us has personal characteristics, personal things that we like that are just about who we are personally. It's a personal preference aspect of attraction. The other two are more broad, right? Biology is very broad, like I said, across culture. Culture is broad within the culture that I'm at. Personal choice, or the personal aspect of attractiveness, is maybe just unique to me. Other people might share those things that I am attracted to, but they're about my personal preferences. And so all 3 of these things make up what is attractive to us. And so when we say that person is attractive to me, it's a combination of the biological, the cultural, and the personal. To kind of put that in a slightly different way in some Venn diagrams. So if you have those 3 elements, right, you think about, and again, these bubbles are different for every person in this room, right? Now, this one is going to look very similar for everyone in the room. This one will look pretty similar to everyone in the room. This one's going to be different for every person. So each one of you has these bubbles that you could list into those bubbles. In fact, that's one of the things I'd like you to start to think about, or if you're taking notes, is you can go ahead and kind of list out these 3 things and start to make a list to yourself, particularly in the culture and personal, about what are those things that I think are culturally attractive to me, that are personally attractive to me. And then those things start to overlap. And if you look at the intersections of these different circles, well, in some cases, 2 of these sections are going to overlap. So in other words, I meet someone, for example, let's talk about this one. I meet someone that is biologically attractive and also culturally attractive in my culture. I'm going to probably find that person somewhat attractive. There might be a different person that maybe is not biologically attractive, but they are attractive to my personal choice and attractive in my culture. I'm also going to be somewhat attracted to that person. Well, who are the people that we're most attracted to? It's going to be the people right in the middle that hit the biological attractiveness, the cultural attractiveness, and the personal attractiveness that I have. So if someone can hit all 3 of those traits, that's who I'm going to find the most attractive. And so again, if you think about moments and people in your life that you've been attracted to, right, and be careful to not just think about physical attractiveness. We're going to kind of separate that a little bit later. So I'm just talking about just generally, I am attracted to that person, meaning I want to get to know them, I want to be in a relationship with them. And if you start to kind of rank those people, okay, who are the people I've met that I've been the most attractive to? Those people are going to be probably more in the center of this diagram. People that you think, yeah, you know, I was kind of attracted to that person, maybe they had a couple. If there's that person that you thought, well, I maybe wouldn't date them, but I consider going on a couple dates, well, maybe they're just in one of those 3 bubbles. And the people that repulse you are somewhere out here in outer darkness on the outside of that chart, right? And so, again, this helps us understand, and this is a really important thing I'm going to come back to several times today, that one thing I want to get out of your minds is that there's some universal standard of what makes someone attractive. Okay, that's simply not true. None of the research supports that. Again, some of that is kind of centered in this biological piece, but there's great variation in cultural and personal attractiveness, which means what makes one person super attractive to one person, it makes them completely unattractive to the next person. Which means if I'm trying to find someone that I'm attracted to, it doesn't mean that I go to my best friend or my mom and say, help me find someone that I'm attracted to, because they might be attracted to something completely different. It also means that when I'm trying to make myself attractive to other people, there's not necessarily one right answer to do that. Again, we'll get into that in a little bit. There's different ways to make yourself attractive based on who do I want to attract to me? What are the types of people that I want to date, that I want to eventually marry? Okay, so let's kind of drill down a little bit more into these 3 areas, and then we'll talk more about kind of what this means and what you can do with it in your daily life. Like I said, I want to talk for just a little bit about the biological component. Don't want to spend a lot of time on this unless people have a lot of questions on it. But there is a lot of research out there, particularly in the neuroscience area and some of the psychology areas, about biological attraction, these universal factors that make us attractive to each other. And there have certainly been some of those things that have been discussed. There's some things that we've seen across cultures, that if you go to the United States, to Southeast Asia, to Africa, to parts of Europe, these things, no matter who you put in the lab, are going to say that these types of people are attractive. And we think, again, that has to do with biology. In fact, across all of what we call the mate selection research, which is kind of a very academic, sciencey way of saying how we date each other and pick our eventual people we reproduce with. The one thing that has been discovered and talked about is the most universal characteristic of attraction is facial symmetry. Maybe you've heard that before, but that is the most universal thing we find that makes people attractive to each other, is if the left side of your face looks like the right side of your face. We don't necessarily know why. There's a bunch of biologists out there and evolutionary psychologists that have made conjectures based on evolution and some idea that facial symmetry means that you can reproduce well and your offspring will survive. But we see that consistently across cultures, is that facial symmetry is this consistent marker of attractiveness. There's been other things that we've seen. Hip to waist ratio with women in particular has been one of those things. In fact, there's actually a number out there. I hesitate to give it because I don't want the women to go home and start measuring their hip and waist ratio. But there is a number that's been proposed out there that says this is kind of universally attractive. And you can probably at least guess that it's your waist smaller than your hips. And again, the assumption is this goes to birthing, right? The whole idea of birthing hips, and she looks like she can produce offspring. There's actually research that backs that up, that across cultures there's something to that. Averageness is a fascinating aspect of this research. In fact, I put up a picture up here so you can kind of test yourself. A lot of this research is done in the lab, where what we do is we'll bring in, I actually don't do this research, but what people that do this research do is they'll bring people into the lab, put them in front of a computer, and they'll show them faces like this. And these are computer-generated faces. And they'll just ask them, rate that person on a scale of usually 1 to 10. How attractive do you think this face is? And they'll give them 50, 100 different faces, and then the faces have been composited based on different things, and they'll look at which faces generate the highest average scores. And so this is just an example of that research. I'm a little tempted to do this, so I'm going to do it anyway. So I want to know who you think is most attractive of this. How many of you think it's A? How many of you think B? How many think C? Okay, so C is the right answer in this. And what they did is, so A is a composite of 5 different people that they averaged all the faces together. B is a composite of 10 different people, and C is a composite of 50 different faces. And they saw the actual research that I pulled this is found the same thing, that people consistently were saying C is the most attractive person. And what that was showing the researchers is C is the one that has the most average facial features. So if you take everyone's nose and put it together, it looks like that. If you take everyone's eyes and put it together, it looks like that. And that's what we've seen again in the research. And because we see that so consistently, we assume that that's biological. It's genetic. There's something in our genes that are making us attractive to averageness, which is kind of interesting, right? We usually think that averageness is a bad thing. When it comes to faces, it's not. Averageness is actually a good thing in the research. Another thing that's been talked about is secondary sexual characteristics. So these are things like big jaw, manually jaw lines for men, things like that, right? So there's other aspects of kind of gendered sexual characteristics that are also kind of universal across cultures. And like I said, all of this is kind of based on evolutionary science. If you're not familiar with evolutionary science, it's based on this idea that even as human beings, we have these kind of genetic predispositions to certain things that are about survival and reproduction, that an evolutionary scientist takes a very pragmatic view of dating, that when you are dating someone, you're trying to find someone that will pass on your genes, and they can pass on your genes for generations and generations to come. And so most of this research is done with people from that perspective. Now, I personally don't like evolutionary psychology very much, and so I don't use it in my own work, but there's enough research to suggest there is at least something to this idea that there are kind of universal aspects of attraction that, again, regardless of time, regardless of generation, regardless of where you live in the world, these are the things that make us attractive to each other. But, as I said, it's only one part of it. It's only one component of this. And so if I don't have an average face, I don't have to give up hope. If I don't have a certain hip-to-weight ratio, I don't have to give up hope. But it is part of what makes us attractive. So let's move to the second piece then, the culture. Now, most of you are familiar with what culture is, right? Culture is a group of people that you interact with that help create what are called norms. And a norm is what you consider normal. And one thing I want to be really clear about, I always repeat this every time I do a seminar or teach in my classes, normal does not necessarily mean healthy. So make sure you don't accidentally equate those two things. Just because everyone does it doesn't mean it's a good thing. But culture gives us these norms, these things that we expect, these things that we think are normal. An important piece of culture, though, to keep in mind is that all of us exist in multiple cultures simultaneously. There's different what we call levels of culture. Usually when we think about culture, we think about our culture in the United States. Although here in Utah, we are a little bit of an exemption to that because we also talk here about what kind of culture? Mormon culture, right? So we're at least more aware, I think, than your average person that there's different levels of culture. We do have this, not even just the US, but we have a Western industrialized culture, right? We are very similar to Europe in some ways and the other modern parts of the world. But we do have a unique US culture that we're all embedded into. We're in a unique Utah culture, right? Most of you are also embedded in a unique Mormon culture. You're in a unique Mormon culture in Utah, right? You can kind of keep drilling down, and even all the way down to the family level, to the city level, right? We won't get into a debate about Salt Lake versus Draper versus Sandy in here, right? But you could, if we wanted to, we could probably have a discussion about different suburb cultures within Salt Lake and Utah County. Your family has its own culture, and that's important because the norms that you experience, what you think is normal, is different potentially at every level of that culture. And so as an individual, when you are thinking about norms in your life, not just about attraction, but about everything, you sometimes get really conflicted information, right? In fact, we even have church lingo about this when it comes to cultural norms, right? How do we talk about the world in good or bad terms? Usually bad. Right? The world is bad. The norms of the world are bad. Church norms are good. Right? We even kind of have that mentality, that lingo that we'll hear in sacrament meeting and Sunday school, that we're aware of those different levels. Now, back to attraction. Lots of research about cultural attraction. Again, these are things that we don't see stay consistent across cultures. That if you go to Asia, if you go to the United States, if you even go to parts of Europe, you're going to get very different responses to this research. Here are some of the examples of things we see. Skin color is a huge one. So based on the culture you're in, certain skin tones and skin colors are more attractive than others. Typically, the dominant skin color in a culture is seen as more attractive. In some cultures, being tanner is attractive. In other cultures, being paler is attractive, right? That differs based on which culture I'm in. Body hair, another great example, right? Facial hair, body hair on men and women varies a lot by culture. in terms of what is attractive. Body fat is another example, and that's a great example as you look across time. So when you see attraction change across time, that's also connected to this cultural element. In fact, there's several really nice YouTube videos or fun YouTube videos, if you haven't seen them before, that show you kind of body types across time, going from Rome to Greece to even back to Egypt. And you can see how what has been considered attractive has shifted. If any of you are into the Renaissance era at all, what was attractive back in the Renaissance with women? If you look at paintings from the Renaissance era, what did those women look like? Yeah, they were bigger, voluptuous, right? High body fat was much more attractive because what did that tell us about you? You were healthy, you had money, you could eat, right? That was attractive. That was based on culture, right? Back in the 90s, when I think a lot of us probably were growing up, what was the ideal female body type? It was super thin. Right? The supermodels of the time, the Cindy Crawfords of the time, super, super thin. That's changed now. If you look at what is considered attractive now with women, we're kind of the pendulum's going back to a little bit more body fat. We kind of went through actually an athletically toned phase during the 2000s, and now it's a little bit more back to the voluptuous, curvy type of mindset. So you see those things fluctuate a lot, again, based on culture. Hairstyle, clothing, also good examples of this cultural attractiveness. Certain hairstyles will change, become more attractive. Certain clothing will change and make us more attractive. And so again, part of what attracts us to people are these cultures. Now again, keep in mind that every level of culture might differ on this. I'll give you a good example here for a second with clothing, right? Within an LDS culture, is there something to the idea of modesty being attractive? Sure. Right? For a lot of Latter-day Saint singles, if I see a man or a woman who's dressed immodestly, there's actually kind of an unattractiveness piece to it. Right? Maybe the biological attractiveness thing is flaring up, but the cultural attractiveness thing might be going down. Right? And wearing more clothing in a lot of religiously conservative groups is actually attractive. I'm more attracted to you because you're dressing more modestly, even though maybe the larger U.S. culture would suggest the opposite. Now, again, the reason I keep bringing that up is that as you're thinking about yourself and if you're making a list for yourself, one of the things that everyone has to figure out is which level of that culture do I value the most. In fact, that's one of the most important things to figure out, in terms of how do I make myself more attractive to other people and how do I figure out what attracts me, is I have to figure out what level of culture matters to me. Is it my mom? Is it my religious culture? Is it my Western modern culture, right? Which one of those matters the most to me? That's going to give me a lot of information about attraction in my own life. This also helps us understand that, at least when it comes to cultural attractiveness, that this is a moving target, which means that what is culturally attractive now, so if we were to spend the next hour and kind of construct the most culturally attractive person possible based on hairstyle and body hair and body type and things, even 3 years down the line, that maybe has completely changed. Right? This is a moving target, which means that if I want to be the most culturally attractive person that I can be, I need to be up to speed on what is culturally attractive at the time. Right? There's actually research, basically what this is saying, there's research to being in style in some ways when it comes to attractiveness, because that helps me be culturally attractive to those that are around me. A couple other notes on cultural attractiveness. I want to spend more time on this one. There's actually a lot of debate in my field about if cultural attractiveness is good or not. There's a lot of debate about if culture anything is good or not when it comes to norms, but particularly with attraction, there's a lot of debate about should we even talk about this. So in other words, there'd be debate about should I even teach you about cultural attraction, because by teaching you about cultural attraction, I'm just giving in to these potential bad things that cultural attraction can do. Now, the reason I'm doing it is that I do think there are some pros to cultural attraction. That understanding this aspect of what makes us attractive to each other has some positive things. On the one hand, and this is what I've already been kind of talking about, and I'll get into a little bit more in just a second, is that because we know that this matters, it actually impacts who dates who gets dates, etc., that understanding cultural messages about attraction helps give me guidelines, which is good, because it helps me know what is attractive to other people. Right? I'm assuming most of us in the room wouldn't like it if all this was biological attraction. Whatever your genes were, that's it. That's all we're going to go on. You've got no control of it, right? Cultural attraction actually gives us an element of control because I can figure out what these guidelines are and I can help utilize them in my own life. Another positive about cultural messages is that it actually helps you in the sense that because we have these standards and because attraction, again, like I said, motivates us, cultural messages and cultural attraction motivates other people to put effort into their appearance and actions. And we could have a debate about if appearance is good or not. I would say at least a minimum personal grooming standard is probably good for all of us in the room. But that actions piece is also important too. That what this does is that when you're going on a first date or a second date or a 20th date with someone, because of this element of cultural attractiveness and because that person getting ready to go on a date with you knows that there's certain standards about what makes them culturally attractive, it's making them put effort into things like their appearance, right? They're getting ready for you. They're getting pretty. They're getting handsome for you. That's generally a good thing because then you feel invested into them. You feel like they're putting effort into me, I'm putting effort into them. There's a duality in our relationship, and as I said before, that helps foster commitment. And so that's good, right? So these cultural standards in some ways are giving us these good things. Now, having said that, I'd be remiss if I didn't at least talk about the negative pieces of this too, because there are some negatives to these cultural elements of what is normative. One of the biggest ones talked about has to do with physical appearance and beauty standards when it comes to culture, that oftentimes the cultural standard for what is beautiful is unattainable for most people. So yes, I understand what my culture wants me to be in terms of BMI, in terms of my weight, in terms of my hairstyle, in terms of my clothing, but I can't attain that. Maybe because of my biology and genetics, maybe because of my income. I can't afford those types of clothes. I can't afford to get my hair cut every single month or colored every single month. And so sometimes these cultural norms become unattainable. And that can lead to psychological harm. Lots of research out there talking about the potential psychological harm in terms of eating disorders, mental health issues, of people trying to live up to cultural ideals. In fact, a little quick tangent on this note. In the last 10 years, the depression researchers, the people that study why people get depressed and anxious, have been talking about how in the entire history of the social sciences, at least when it comes to depression, which goes back to about the last 100 years, we now have the single best predictor we've ever seen of depression and anxiety. Anyone want to guess what it is? It's Facebook usage. Social media usage. That there is an extremely consistent and strong positive correlation between how many hours you're on Facebook and how depressed you are. And we think it has to do with culture, right? Is that what do people post on their social media pages? All the good stuff, right? And if they post the negative stuff, you unfollow them because that's no fun. Right? Or maybe you keep like that one or two friend that's like completely ruining their life because it makes you feel a little bit better about yourself. But most people we see on Instagram or Facebook or whatever social media that we look at, we see these kind of idealized views of people and their families and their kids and their dating lives and just them doing all these fun things. And those cultural norms, when they start to feel unattainable, are problematic. And so that is something that researchers have talked about that is a slight problem with this cultural attraction piece, is when we feel like we can't attain it, there's a lot of correlates to kind of unhealthy psychological health. The other thing that this can do that's been talked about is that even though there's actually a pretty broad range of what culture considers attractive, sometimes we narrow down on just a very narrow list of those things. And this is where kind of media in particular is the culprit. So in other words, even though your culture gives you lots of messages about different ways you can be attractive, we tend to hone in on things like TV and YouTube and kind of the media elements, which tend to give us a much more focused view of what is attractive or not. And that narrows our range of things that we're looking for. And we know that anytime someone narrows their range of things they're looking for in dating, they're less likely to date and less likely to get married. Because I've narrowed what we call my marriage market. Is now I've taken all the people out there in the ocean and I've said I only want these three things. Those are the only three things that I care about. Right? Oftentimes when it comes to cultural attractiveness, it's things like height, BMI, right? So you put height and weight together, you get BMI, and hair are kind of the two things oftentimes that people focus on a lot and kind of makeup with women. a lot of times. And we forget all these other things that culture tells us that might make us attractive. And so that can be somewhat problematic. And then the third thing that can happen, this kind of ties into what I was just saying a little bit, there's also a lot of discussion about how sometimes when we narrow down, particularly in the last decade, and again, particularly as we think about media, sometimes there can be an overemphasis on sexual characteristics. And this actually ties into another area I've done a lot of research on, which is pornography. And the proliferation of pornography in our modern culture that has socialized a lot of people to be highly focused on sexual attraction in relationships. In fact, one of the things outside of LDS culture that you'll see a lot of singles talk about is sexual chemistry. And so if I were to give a similar like this anywhere outside of Utah, that would be one of the biggest things a group like this would be talking about and thinking about. Am I sexually compatible or sexually attracted to that person? Because the idea is that that's super important. I want to be sexually attracted. We need to be sexually compatible because there's nothing worse to a lot of young adults, young single people, or even older single people than condemning yourself to a lifetime of bad sex. Now, interestingly, myself and some of my colleagues did several research studies that actually tested sexual compatibility versus what we called sexual restraint, which we looked at people that were testing things out before they got married versus the people that were waiting till after they got married. And lo and behold, the people that were abstaining from sex till after they got married did a lot better. In fact, they were more sexually satisfied in marriage than the people that were testing this compatibility theory. And so a lot of research have talked about that's also potentially problematic. That as a dater, I don't want to get, one, focused in on just a narrow range of things that my culture is telling me, but two, I also don't want to overemphasize the physical aspect of the relationship and that what is physically attractive. In fact, I've talked to many, many singles and people in relationships that really get hung up on that. I'm not attracted to him or her, or I'm not completely attracted to him, or I woke up today. In fact, one of the worst stories, I'll tell you this one real quick. As a BYU professor in this field, you can imagine how many times per semester I'll get a student, and my colleagues will get a student that comes in with dating advice or questions. And this one didn't actually happen to me. It happened to one of my colleagues, but he had a student, a male student, that came in distraught about his relationship. He'd been dating this woman for, I believe, 6-8 months, which is like forever, right, in Mormondom. They were engaged, they were planning to get married, and he was distraught as he came to my colleague and he said, I don't know if I can go through with the marriage. I don't know if I can do this anymore. I'm not attracted to my fiance. And my colleague asked him, he said, well, what happened? He said, well, just the other day, I went over to her apartment, I was going to surprise her, we were going to go to lunch, and she answered the door and she didn't have makeup on. And I wasn't attracted to her without makeup on. And I'm worried that our marriage will fail because of that. And my colleague actually had to resist getting her contact information so he could warn her about him. But that's an illustration of what happens to a lot of us, is we overemphasize the physical aspect of the relationship, which is important, right? We don't want to dismiss it and say you want to go marry someone you're unattracted to, but we overemphasize it oftentimes too much and forget about this more wide array of things that my culture says is attractive. Now, speaking of that, I want to spend a couple minutes, I forgot about this last one, because I don't want to talk too much about gender in here. But I do want to recognize the other piece to this is that oftentimes the other negative thing culture can do when it comes to attractiveness is it can promote unhealthy gender stereotypes. This idea that men have to be a certain way, women have to be a certain way, or they're not attractive anymore. And that can also kind of interfere. Again, it's tied to this narrow range. A lot of these things are about narrowing our range about what is attractive. So here's what I want to kind of, one more aspect of the cultural attractiveness before we talk a little bit about the personal piece. I want to recognize that there is a unique LDS element to culture, which is what, and this is not an academic term, but spiritual attractiveness. There's something very real about this, and that LDS singles actually tend to put a very high emphasis on this, even though we don't talk about it a lot. And what I mean by spiritual attractiveness is that in a highly religious culture like ours, there are religious activities that people do that actually make them more attractive to the opposite sex. It makes me more attractive to you to see you do these things. And these are some of the markers that we see tend to do this for both men and women. One of those things, and this one we could kind of debate if this is good or not, is hitting what we call spiritual life markers. These are things like serving a mission. These are things like getting baptized. These are, having a current temple recommend, right? In our church, we've got these very clear markers that you're supposed to hit or kind of continually hit. Those are things that oftentimes make people more spiritually attractive. Oh, he went and did a temple session, or he does a temple session every week, or she serves in the temple every week. That actually makes us more attractive in the LDS market. Oftentimes. Engaging in church meetings is actually a big one. I actually said this as a joke about 6 years ago in one of my big 200 people classes at BYU. And I got way more nods from women in particular than I thought. And so I've talked about it more and more, and I'm convinced this is an actual phenomenon about this testimony phenomenon. That when that guy gets up there in fast and testimony meeting and bears that strong testimony, there are women in the room, taboo or not to talk about, they're like, I am attracted to him now. I wasn't before, but now I've got my eye on that guy. And I think it goes both ways as well. Magnifying callings, home visiting teaching, right? Primary teaching, whatever my calling is, magnifying it is attractive in this culture. And I think a lot of these things actually go to that last one, which is we value service a lot in the church. And being service-oriented, whether it's in my church callings, whether it's outside of church, that is very attractive in an LDS culture. And it's attractive because that's what a lot of LDS singles want. I want someone that's going to serve me, that's going to serve my kids, that's serving other people, because we attribute it to Christ, which is a good thing. Right? That's what Christ was like, but that makes people attractive. Now, the important thing, and the reason why I bring this up, is that what this does in our unique LDS singles market is it actually exaggerates all these other things we've been talking about. And in some ways, it can actually overcome some of these other aspects that we've talked about. You've all seen the Mormon couples where you look at them and you're like, what happened there? Like, how did that end up with that? I wouldn't be surprised if there's a testimony meeting in there somewhere. Right, where that happened. But even if I find someone attractive to begin with, these things can magnify that, right? So if I find that person biologically attractive and culturally attractive, and they have these spiritual components to them, those are the people that actually end up leaving the LDS singles market, oftentimes, more often than not. In fact, I'm going to show you the most depressing slide I show my BYU students, at least in my freshman class, because a lot of them are still single. This is data. This is the only data slide I'm going to show you today. But this is the percent of single Latter-day Saints who say that spirituality is important very often. So it's a very crude measure of a spiritual attractiveness. Because what we see happen is if someone says this, they tend to have a temple recommend, they go to sacrament meeting, they magnify their calling. So what percent of LDS singles at different ages are hitting into this very often category for men and women? Now, if you're paying any attention to the church at all in your age demographic for most of you, you'll probably know what the men do. They look like this. That we see this steady decline in the percent of Latter-day Saint single men that are spiritually attractive. In fact, this is the biggest demographic the church is worried about. One of the fun things I get to do, and I get to do a lot of fun things, but one of the fun things I get to do in my job is get summoned to Salt Lake, sometimes to church headquarters, and work with the RID division, which is the Research and Information Division of a church headquarters, which is the group that does research on the church and reports to the general authorities about different aspects of it. And in my interactions with that group, I know that this is one of the demographics they're most concerned about, that they know that pretty much the only thing that keeps a lot of single men in the church is getting temple married. That if a man is not temple married by their late 20s, the activity rate drops off dramatically. And so there's lots of things that go into that. But one of the ways you can interpret this graph is that, well, what's happening to a lot of these spiritually attractive men? Well, they're getting married. Now, the issue comes when we put the female graph on there. It fluctuates a little bit, but it trends upward, actually, more than anything. What we see happen over time is there starts to be this gap that starts to open up over time. And a lot of you have probably seen this phenomenon sometimes, at least a lot of the women in your mid-adults singles areas of the church, even some of the young adult single areas, is that there is about 4 single Latter-day Saint women for every 1 single adult male in the church right now. And so there's this gap that opens up. But it gives us some quantitative evidence of what I'm talking about, that spiritual attractiveness does actually influence the marriage market. Now, that doesn't mean that every spiritually attractive, I'm going to assume all of you are very spiritually attractive people, right? It doesn't mean that it's an automatic guarantee, but it is one of those things that does increase my odds. That if I want to maximize my odds of getting married and in a healthy marriage, being spiritually attractive is in many ways vital in an LDS singles market, at least if I want to marry in the temple and marry another active Latter-day Saint. Okay, a couple quick notes on the personal side, and then I want to talk more about kind of what does all this mean, what can you do with it. Like I said, these are the personal traits that you find uniquely attractive to other people, and the opposite, right? So the one thing, interesting thing about a personal part of attraction is the other two parts, biological and culture, tend to tell us what is attractive, not so much what isn't attractive, or maybe it's just assumed what isn't attractive because it's not there. Personal traits will tell us about both. You have unique personal things that you find both attractive and unattractive. These are some of the most common things that fall into that personal attractiveness characteristics. Things like politics, political party. Right? I find Republicans really attractive, or Democrats really attractive. Movie and book likes, different genres of movies. I might find someone really attractive that loves horror movies or romantic comedies. Hair color. It's not hairstyle per se, that's more of a cultural attractive, but hair color is oftentimes a personal preference. Makeup. Right? Again, there's some cultural elements of that, but there's also, you'll see a lot of personal variation in how much makeup do I like on a woman. What kind of makeup do I like? Do I like certain lipstick colors, certain eyeliner colors? Do I like makeup on a guy or not? Right? Those are going to vary person to person. Career trajectories. Right? Do I want a guy or a woman that is really dedicated to their job and career trajectory? Or do I want someone that doesn't care what they do and rather spend all their time at home? Height is another classic example of this. I like tall guys or short guys. Right? These are all personal preferences that vary person to person. Now, the interesting thing about one of the interesting things about personal attraction, this is what we talk about the most. And so when you come home from a date and you talk about what you liked or disliked about that person you're on a date, you're almost always talking about the personal attractiveness bubble in your life. It's also what we argue about a lot. So when you have these little fights with your peers about, whether Hugh Jackman is attractive or not, or whether that celebrity is attractive or not, or whether that person in your war is attractive, you're oftentimes arguing about personal traits, which is interesting because it means you'll never win. It doesn't really matter at the end of the day anyway. But this is these personal things that are unique to you. So every person has different traits, as I've said. Okay, so what does all this mean? So I've given you a lot of kind of information about what is attraction. Let's talk about what you can do with it. What this tells us is that there are 3 ways to be attractive to other people, and one of them you have really no control over, which is the biological, right? So I told you about it, so you know about it, and I'm not really going to talk about it again, because you can't really do anything about it. You can't change your genes, right? That's kind of what plastic surgery is going to be about, but I'm not going to advocate that for anyone. So you can't do that, anything. The other 2, though, you can do something about, to a degree, at least in one case. On the personal attractiveness side, you can kind of do something about that, but it's important to keep in mind that this is a guessing game. The first couple dates with someone, you're not probably going to know what they find personally attractive, right? Unless it's a known potential partner. So if you grew up with someone and you knew them since high school and you've known them for the last decade, you might actually know what is personally attractive to them. Well, that's great. You know what to do, right? You know what to emphasize. I know, okay, they really like someone with a good sense of humor. I've heard them come home date after date and talk about that person was funny, that person was not funny. I need to make sure I'm funny on that date, right? So you can do that, but if it's someone you don't know very well or a blind date, it's not going to help you very much. Now, an important piece to this, though, is that let's say you do know some of these personal things. There is a difference between emphasizing a trait and manipulating someone. In other words, let's go back to the example I was just saying. If I know that someone I'm going to go on a date with really values humor, and I'm naturally a very cynical person and sarcastic person I don't like doing humor, don't try to do that on a date, right? Don't try to manipulate that person to liking you, because guess what? Over 50 or 60 years, they're going to figure out you're not funny. Or at least you're funny maybe in a different way than they're attracted to, okay? So this is about identifying, at least if I know what they are, identifying the things that that person finds personally attractive, and if I have them, I can emphasize them on dates. I can emphasize them in that relationship to make me more attractive to that person. Now, your real power, though, comes in the cultural piece, as I said, because these are things that are more universally found as attractive. These are things where we have these clear guidelines, and it's the easiest thing that we can manipulate. I use the word manipulation, I shouldn't do that. The easiest thing we can change, alter, to help us be more attractive to potential partners. And all this is about learning the cultural signals of being attractive. In other words, this is simply about sitting down and thinking to myself, what makes someone culturally attractive in my culture? And what oftentimes gets in people's way sometimes is this desire to be counterculture. Well, I know how I'm supposed to dress as a woman, but I don't want to conform. I'm unique, I want to do my own thing. That's great, it's going to make you less attractive in the dating market. Right? So if you want to do that and you want to go attract someone that's also countercultural, that's great, but realize that your marriage market has shrunk. If I want to be attracted to the most amount of people possible, I want to learn what these things are and do them. Particularly, again, in the early dating period where, like I said, that attraction is going to facilitate effort and commitment in the relationship. That's where this becomes most important. So some people oftentimes have to get past this initial, I don't want to do that. I don't want to make myself look like I'm supposed to. But all the research suggests there's actually something to that. There's something to making myself culturally attractive to other people. Okay. Any initial questions, burning questions so far? Okay. All right, so let's kind of keep adding this. So that's kind of the basic gist of attraction, but there's one other part of this that kind of gets added on as another layer, and that's outward and inward attraction. You notice I haven't talked much about physical attraction per se. We've been talking just generally about attraction. There is something important to at least mention about the differences between outward physical appearance and more we call inward attraction. So you can see the difference between those two as I have on the slide is that outward attraction are the outward physical aspects of another person that make us attracted to them. And those are still going to be based on that combination we've talked about. So biological, cultural, and personal characteristics, right? So there are outward things about the person that I see or I interact with that makes them outwardly, physically attracted to me. But there's also inward attraction, which you'll notice, I have to have this on the next bottom part, that the inward part is there and it's important, but it's actually not connected to biology more. This is just culture and personal preference. These are things like humor, personality, intelligence, right? Liking a certain sports team, right? Not the outward physical stuff, but all the inward things about that person that make me attractive. And again, this is adding another layer, because what it's telling me is, okay, the most attractive people to me in my life are going to be biologically, culturally, and personally attractive, both inside and out to me. That is the gold standard to who I'm going to be the most attracted to, is someone that I am outwardly and inwardly attracted to at all of these levels. Now again, a lot of people don't necessarily even marry someone that fits all those characteristics, but oftentimes people will marry people that fit a lot of these, right, on the inward and the outward side of it, across the biological, cultural, and personal preferences. Back to the stages of relationships, another thing to keep in mind is what research suggests to us, and this is probably not surprising to most of us, outward attraction is much more important early in the relationship. In other words, when I talked about that catalyst for contact that attraction does, it makes me go across the room and start to talk to you, that's usually outward attraction. Inward attraction tends to be more important later on in the relationship. As I date you, as we develop a relationship, we start to emphasize more inward attraction, and usually it's about 1 to 2 months where you see that switch happen. In fact, that's an important aspect of relationships to keep in mind. I've got more detail on this in a slide coming up in just a minute or two. But once you get past the 1 to 2 month mark, which is about the time that most people start to date exclusively, so we're committed and exclusive to each other, outward attraction starts to become less and less, important in the relationship. And most married couples, again, not that they're not physically attracted to each other anymore, but it's not the main reason they're attracted to each other. The shift has happened to inward, which is actually really important, because eventually we're all going to get really old and really wrinkly and kind of gross. Right? And if everything is based on outward attraction, relationships don't work very well. And so this natural shift we see is actually good for the long-term health of relationships. Now, let's get into that a little bit more detail. So I want to kind of take everything we've talked about and kind of walk through then what typically happens in a relationship from beginning through a marriage when it comes to attraction. Again, I've kind of talked about this shift, but let's kind of show you in a visual what is happening. So what we tend to see happen is that, again, before dating occurs, so before we actually go on a date with each other, we have a almost complete, if not total, emphasis on outward attraction. Again, biological, cultural, personal preferences, outward physical attraction is that catalyst that we talked about. So I'm focused on the physical. That's what makes me start to pay attention to you. That's what draws me to you, makes me want to contact you.